There is an island on the map right now that does not exist. Not a legend, not a myth. An actual island, printed on actual charts, sitting in the ocean between Australia and New Caledonia for more than 100 years. And when a ship finally sailed to the exact coordinates to look at it, there was nothing there but 1,400 meters of open water. So here's the question I want to leave with you tonight, as you settle in and let your shoulders drop. How does a place disappear? Not slowly, not gently, but completely, from the sea, from the maps, from memory. What did 3 lighthouse keepers on a rock in the North Atlantic see? On a December night in 1900, before they walked out into the weather and were never found again? Why did an entire island in the Bay of Bengal quietly go under the waves, taking an international border dispute down with it? And what happens to a country when the land it is standing on begins, very politely and very patiently, to stop being there? That's where we're going tonight. 100 facts about lost islands. Islands that sank. Islands that burned. Islands that were bombed out of existence, or mined down to bare rock, or simply walked away from by the last families who could no longer bear the winters. Islands that were never real to begin with, but that sailors swore they had seen, and mapmakers dutifully drew, and other sailors then died looking for. We're going to take it slowly, very slowly. There is no rush here at all, and nothing you need to remember. If you drift off somewhere around the 20th island or the 40th, or in the middle of a sentence about a Sicilian volcano that 4 countries once went to war over, that's completely fine. That's rather the point. The story will still be here, and the islands will still be gone, and neither of those things needs anything from you tonight. So get comfortable. Let the room go quiet around you, and let's start with the emptiest place on the map. Pause. The first island I want to tell you about is called Sandy Island, and its story is a small, perfect example of how the world can be wrong for a very long time without anybody noticing. It sat in the Coral Sea, east of Australia, west of New Caledonia. On the charts, it was long and thin, running roughly north to south, about 24 kilometers from tip to tip, larger than Manhattan. It appeared on maps published by respectable institutions. It was in the World Vector Shoreline Database. It was on Google Earth, rendered as a strange black smear, as though the satellites themselves couldn't quite decide what they were photographing. And then, in November of 2012, an Australian research vessel called the Southern Surveyor was passing through that stretch of water on a geological survey, and the scientists aboard noticed a discrepancy. Their navigation charts said island. Their depth sounder said ocean. So they did the only sensible thing. They sailed straight over the top of it. The water beneath the hull was around 1,400 meters deep. There was no island. There had never been an island. And the ship's crew, rather delighted with themselves, reported that they had undiscovered it. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, and this is our second fact of the night. Sandy Island was not somebody's idle invention. The trail leads back to a whaling ship called the Velocity, which reported heavy breakers and sandy islets in that area in 1876. The British Admiralty, being conscientious, recorded the sighting. And once a thing is on an Admiralty chart, it has a way of staying there. It was copied onto the next chart, and the next, and eventually onto the digital databases that every modern map is quietly built from. 136 years of inheritance passed down without anybody stopping to check. What the crew of the Velocity actually saw, nobody knows for certain. Possibly a pumice raft, a floating mat of volcanic rock from an undersea eruption, drifting on the surface and looking from a distance, in poor light, exactly like land. Think about that for a moment as you're lying there. A raft of floating stone seen once at dusk by a tired man on a whaling ship. And it became a place. It got a name. It got coordinates. It survived 2 world wars and the entire space age. Our third island is Bermeja, and Bermeja is stranger still, because Bermeja had lawyers. It was drawn in the Gulf of Mexico, north of the Yucatan Peninsula, and it first appears in Spanish charts of the 1500s. A Spanish cartographer named Alonso de Santa Cruz put it on a map around 1539, and it was described as reddish or blondish in color, which is where the name comes from. For 4 centuries, it stayed there. Then, in the 1990s, Mexico went looking for it, because under modern maritime law, an island, even a tiny one, projects an exclusive economic zone around itself, and this particular patch of the Gulf sits on top of a great deal of oil. Ships went, aircraft went. In 2009, the National Autonomous University of Mexico sent a full survey expedition, and there was nothing. No island, no shoal, no reef, just water, which produced, as you might imagine, our 4th fact, one of the more entertaining conspiracy theories in cartographic history. Mexican senators publicly speculated that the CIA had blown the island up to shift the maritime boundary in favor of American drilling rights. It's almost certainly not true. Islands are quite hard to blow up, and satellites tend to notice. But it tells you something about how much a small piece of land can be worth, and how uncomfortable people become when one goes missing. Let's stay with these ghost islands a while longer, because they're the gentlest place to start, and because they belong to a category cartographers actually have a name for. They're called Phantom Islands, and there are, or were, hundreds of them. Number 5 is my favorite of the old ones. High Brazil. It has nothing to do with the country of Brazil. The name most likely comes from the Irish Ui Bresale, a clan name, meaning something like the descendants of Bresal. In Irish tradition, it was an island in the Atlantic west of Ireland, shrouded in mist, visible only once every 7 years. And here is what makes it remarkable. It was not merely folklore. From around 1325, when a cartographer named Angelino Dolcert drew it, High Brazil appeared on serious commercial navigation charts for over 500 years. It was almost always drawn the same way, a near-perfect circle, cut in half by a channel through the middle, a donut of land in the empty ocean west of Galway. Expeditions sailed from Bristol to find it in the 1400s. A man named John Nisbet claimed to have landed there in 1674 and to have met an old man who gave the crew gold and silver. And it survived on British Admiralty charts, downgraded at last to Brazil Rock until 1865. Sit with that, 1865. The American Civil War was ending, photography existed, and a mist-wrapped fairy island was still faintly on the map. Our 6th phantom is Friesland, and Friesland is a masterpiece of a different kind, because Friesland was almost certainly a fraud. In 1558, a Venetian nobleman named Niccolò Zeno published a book and a map, claiming they were based on letters and charts left behind by his ancestors, 2 brothers who had supposedly voyaged into the North Atlantic in the 1300s. The map showed an enormous island south of Iceland, Friesland, with a coastline of bays and towns and detailed place names, and the great cartographers of the age believed it. Mercator put Friesland on his world map. Ortelius put it in his atlas. Martin Frobisher, sailing for the Northwest Passage, sighted the southern coast of Greenland and confidently identified it as Friesland, because that's what the chart said should be there. For over a century, an island that never existed sat in the middle of the busiest ocean in the world, and everyone simply worked around it. And that leads directly into number 7, which is one of those tidy little tragedies of history. On Frobisher's third voyage, in 1578, a fishing vessel called the Emmanuel, a type of boat known as a bus, became separated from the fleet on the way home and reported sighting an unknown island. It was named Bus Island. It went onto the charts. Ships were sent to find it and failed. And rather than delete it, cartographers did something wonderfully human. They decided it must have sunk. It was redrawn as the sunken land of Bus, a submerged shoal, and has stayed on maps in that ghostly, downgraded form into the 1800s. The Hudson's Bay Company even claimed ownership of it in 1776. Nobody wanted to admit the island had never been there. It was easier to believe the sea had taken it. Let that settle over you for a second, because it's a pattern you'll hear again and again tonight. People find it much easier to believe a place has been lost than to believe it was never found. Our 8th island is Antilia, sometimes called the Isle of the Seven Cities, and it comes with one of the loveliest legends of the medieval Atlantic. The story goes that in the year 714, as the Iberian Peninsula fell to Muslim conquest, 7 Christian bishops fled westward across the ocean with their congregations, found an island, burned their ships so no one could turn back, and founded 7 cities there. From around 1424, Antilia appears on charts as a large rectangular island out in the mid-Atlantic. And here's the part I find genuinely moving. It was still believed in when Columbus sailed. Some historians think Antilia's supposed position helped convince navigators that the Western Ocean was crossable at all, that there was somewhere out there to aim for. The island was imaginary. The confidence it produced was not. And when real land was eventually found, the name stuck to it sideways. The Antilles, in the Caribbean, are named for an island that was never there, which brings us 9th to St. Brendan's Isle. Brendan was a real Irish monk of the 6th century, and the tale of his voyage, the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, was one of the best-selling stories of medieval Europe. He and his companions sail west in a leather boat, and they encounter an island of birds that sing psalms, a sea of glass, a column of crystal in the ocean, and a great fish they mistake for an island and light a fire on until it wakes up and swims away. Read that last one again, half asleep, and tell me it isn't a beautiful image. Somewhere in all of this, medieval mapmakers decided the blessed Isle of St. Brendan must be a real location, and they drew it, usually west of Ireland, sometimes near the Canaries. Residents of the Canary Islands reported seeing it on the horizon for centuries and called it San Borondon. Formal expeditions sailed to find it in 1526, 1570, and again in 1721. Everyone came back empty. Our 10th island has a name that would make a fine title all by itself: the Isle of Demons. It was drawn off the coast of Newfoundland, and sailors said you could hear voices there, a roar of unseen creatures and shrieking on the wind, and, attached to it, is one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the 16th century, which is fact number 11, and which I want to tell you properly. In 1542, a French nobleman named Jean-François de la Roque de Roberval sailed to establish a colony in what is now Canada. Aboard was his young relative, Marguerite de la Roque. During the voyage, Marguerite began an affair with a young man on the ship. Roberval, enraged, marooned her on a barren island off the coast, along with her nurse, an elderly woman named Damienne. Her lover leapt overboard and swam ashore to join them. What followed is almost unbearable. The lover died. Marguerite gave birth. The baby died. Damienne died. And Marguerite, alone now, on a rock in the North Atlantic, survived. She shot bears. She kept a fire. She endured, by most accounts, more than 2 years, until Basque fishermen found her and carried her home to France. Her story was written down by 2 people who claimed to have met her, including Marguerite de Navarre, the Queen of Navarre, who put a version of it in her collection of tales, the Heptameron. And the island she was left on became, in the retelling, the Isle of Demons, a place of screaming spirits. Modern researchers think the screaming was seabirds, hundreds of thousands of them, nesting on the cliffs. Can you picture that? 2 years of seabird noise and grief and cold. And she came back. And the island she survived on has since quietly slid off the map, unlocatable, its exact identity still argued over. If you're already drifting, that's just fine. Stay with the sound and let the details go where they like. Our 12th phantom takes us to the far south, into the gray wilderness of the Southern Ocean, and to a man named George Norris. In 1825, Captain Norris, sailing a whaler, reported discovering a new island near Bouvet, a black volcanic mass with a peak on it, which he named Thompson Island. He gave coordinates. He described it in detail. And for the next 70 years, ships looked for it. The German Valdivia expedition searched in 1898 and found deep water. Others tried. Nothing was ever found again. And here is the odd wrinkle. Some researchers have wondered whether Thompson Island might have been real and might have collapsed, because that stretch of ocean is volcanically active, and islands there genuinely do come and go. The British Admiralty only removed it from the charts in 1943. It had outlived the man who saw it by more than a century. 13. The Aurora Islands. In 1762, a Spanish ship named the Aurora reported 3 islands in the South Atlantic, between the Falklands and South Georgia. 30 years later, in 1794, a survey ship called the Atrevida did something even more convincing. It took careful positional readings and described the islands in detail, one of them capped with snow, another with a distinctive saddle shape. This was not a drunken sighting. This was professional Spanish naval surveying. And yet the auroras were never seen again. Later expeditions found nothing. The most likely explanation is that they were the shag rocks, a real cluster of jagged islets, misplaced by a few degrees of longitude in an era when longitude was still a nightmare to measure at sea. But nobody has ever proved it, and the auroras kept their place on charts for the better part of a century. 14th on our list is Dougherty Island, and this one is almost poignant. Captain Daniel Dougherty of the whaler James Stewart reported it in 1841, in the vast emptiness of the South Pacific between New Zealand and Cape Horn, an island about 5 miles long, with a high bluff at the northeast end and snow on the top. Others claimed to sight it afterwards, which only made it more credible. And then, In 1931, an Australian named John King Davis took the ship Discovery through the region on a systematic sweep and found precisely nothing. He also erased Emerald Island in the same voyage, our 15th fact, an island reported in 1821 by Captain William Elliot of the ship Emerald, south of New Zealand. Davis sailed over both of them, 2 more islands quietly deleted from the world in a single expedition. Imagine that as a job description. You are not going out to discover anything. You are going out to prove that the sea is empty and to take 2 names off the map forever. Number 16 is the phantom that got a novel written about it. Maria Theresa Reef was reported in 1843 by Captain Asaph Tabor of the American whaler Maria Theresa in the South Pacific east of New Zealand, and Jules Verne, who read everything, seized on it. In Search of the Castaways, and again in The Mysterious Island, Verne used this speck of land, calling it Tabor Island after the captain, as a plot location. Millions of readers grew up knowing it. Ships searched for it into the 20th century. It was quietly removed from French navigational charts only in recent decades, and there is a real argument that the reef never existed at all, and that Verne gave permanent literary life to a mistake in a whaler's logbook. 17. The Rupes Nigra. This one is pure medieval cosmology, and it's my favorite thing to fall asleep thinking about. On Mercator's world map of 1569 at the North Pole, there is a black rock, a single magnetic mountain, 33 leagues around, surrounded by a whirlpool of 4 converging rivers and 4 land masses. That was the accepted geography of the top of the world. Compasses point north, the reasoning went, so there must be something enormously magnetic up there pulling them. Mercator's source appears to have been a lost 14th century book called the Inventio Fortunatae, written by an English friar who claimed to have traveled to the Arctic. That book has never been found. We know it only through people describing it. So at the very top of every serious map of the world, for generations, there sat a black magnetic island, described in a book that no longer exists, by a man whose name we're not even sure of. Our 18th phantom island is Podesta, off the coast of Chile, reported in 1879 by an Italian captain sailing the ship Barone Podesta. It sat on Chilean charts for over a century and was only formally removed in 2001, and the 19th belongs to the Arctic, and it comes with a genuinely dark story attached. In 1906, Robert Peary, the American explorer, famous, ambitious, endlessly in need of wealthy sponsors, stood on the northern coast of Ellesmere Island and reported seeing land far out across the frozen sea to the northwest. He named it Crockerland, after George Crocker, a San Francisco banker who had given money to his expeditions. 7 years later, in 1913, a full expedition set out to reach it, led by Peary's former assistant, Donald McMillan. They traveled for weeks across the sea ice with Inuit guides, and there, on the horizon, was Crockerland, hills and valleys, shining, unmistakable. McMillan wrote about the thrill of it. They pushed toward it for days. It kept receding. Eventually, one of the Inuit guides told McMillan plainly what it was. Poo Jock, mist, a fata morgana, a superior mirage, in which cold air over ice bends light and lifts a distorted image of distant ice or open water into the sky, and hangs it there, looking exactly like mountains. And this is our 20th fact of the night, and it is the reason I've never quite been able to romanticize that expedition. The Crocker Land expedition ended up stranded for 4 years. During it, a young member of the party named Fitzhugh Green shot and killed his Inuit guide, Pugatok, on the ice. Green's own account claimed a struggle in a blizzard. No charges were ever brought. A man died for a mirage, for a place that was made of nothing but light, bending over ice, named after a banker, by an explorer who needed one more donation. Sit with that a moment. Then let it go. We have a long night ahead, and the water's getting warmer from here, because Peary was not alone in seeing things at the top of the world. Our 21st fact concerns Frederick Cook, Peary's great rival, who claimed to have reached the North Pole in 1908. Along the way, Cook reported sighting land and named it Bradley Land, after John R. Bradley, the gambling house owner who had financed him. He even published photographs of it. Later analysis of those photographs suggested something rather awkward: that Bradley Land was ice, pressure ridges and flows, photographed at an angle that made them look like a distant coast. Two men racing each other for the same prize, each conjuring a continent out of the Arctic air and naming it after the man who paid the bills. There's something almost tender about it, if you squint, and something very human. The 22nd and last of our phantoms, before we turned to islands that were real and went away, is a group called Los Jardines, the Gardens, placed in the western Pacific by Spanish navigators in the 1500s. They stayed on charts for 4 centuries. Ships hunted for them. The United States Navy was still formally searching that patch of the Pacific in the 20th century, and Los Jardines was only removed from official charts in the 1970s. 400 years. And this is worth pausing on, because it's the thread running through all 22 of these. Nobody ever wants to be the person who deletes an island. Adding 1 is discovery. Removing 1 is admitting that a great many careful people were wrong for a very long time. So the phantom stays, drifting from chart to chart, outliving everyone who believed in it. So let's slow right down now, because we're moving into different water. Pause. Because for every island that never existed, there is one that absolutely did, and then didn't. Our 23rd fact takes us to the Aegean Sea, around 1600 years before Christ, and to an island called Thera. Today, we call it Santorini, and if you have ever seen a photograph of Santorini, those white villages perched on the rim of an enormous curved cliff, looking down into deep blue water, you have been looking at the inside of a wound. That crescent shape is not a coastline. It is the edge of a hole. Thera was once a round island with a mountain in the middle, and in the late Bronze Age that mountain destroyed itself in one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the last 10,000 years. The center of the island collapsed into the sea. What we call Santorini today is only the rim. 24. On that island, buried under meters of volcanic ash, is a town called Akrotiri, and it is one of the most haunting archaeological sites on Earth. Excavations begun in 1967 by the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos revealed a sophisticated Bronze Age settlement, multi-story buildings, indoor plumbing, drainage systems, and walls covered in frescoes so vivid they seem wet, blue monkeys, antelopes, a fleet of ships, young men carrying fish, a woman gathering saffron. It is often compared to Pompeii. But there is one enormous difference, and it's a difference that changes how the whole place feels. At Pompeii, they found bodies. At Akrotiri, they found almost none. no skeletons in the streets, no treasure left behind. Which means, almost certainly, that the people of Thera got warning. Earthquakes, tremors, the ground telling them something, and they left. They packed what they could carry, and they sailed away, and their town was buried behind them, perfectly preserved, waiting 3,500 years for someone to come back and sweep the ash off the paintings. Where they went, nobody knows. And 25 is a small, strange footnote that I find quietly beautiful. Marinatos, the man who found Akrotiri, died at the site in 1974, and he is buried there, in the town he spent his life uncovering. He's the one resident of Akrotiri whose grave we can point to. Now, here's where things get really interesting, because Thera brings us, inevitably, unavoidably, to the most famous lost island of them all, 26, Atlantis. And I want to be precise about this, because the popular version has drifted a long way from the source. Atlantis has exactly one origin. 2 dialogues written by the Greek philosopher Plato, around 360 years before Christ, called the Timaeus and the Critias. In them, a character recounts a story that the Athenian statesman Solon supposedly heard from Egyptian priests at the city of Sais, a story about a great island power beyond the Pillars of Hercules, larger than Libya and Asia combined, which grew arrogant, tried to conquer the Mediterranean, was defeated by an idealized ancient Athens, and then, in Plato's words, in a single day and night of misfortune, sank beneath the sea. That's it. That's the entire textual foundation. Every book, documentary, expedition, and late-night theory since traces back to those pages. 27. And this is the detail almost nobody mentions. The Critias breaks off mid-sentence. Plato never finished it. The dialogue stops, quite literally, in the middle of Zeus preparing to address the gods about what to do with the Atlanteans. Whether Plato lost interest or died before finishing, or simply never intended to complete a story he was using as a moral fable about civic arrogance, we don't know. The most influential lost island in human history is an unfinished draft. 28. And still, the parallels with Thera are hard to ignore. A wealthy maritime civilization in the eastern Mediterranean, destroyed by the sea, with its central land collapsing. The Minoan world on Crete was severely disrupted in the centuries around the Thera eruption, and Thera itself did quite literally sink in a day. Many scholars think a folk memory of that catastrophe, carried through 1,000 years of retelling and then transplanted into the Atlantic, is the seed at the center of Plato's story. Others think Plato invented it whole, as philosophers do. Both camps are made of serious people. Nobody has settled it, and I rather like that we can't. If you're drifting now, good. Let the blue monkeys and the ash and the unfinished sentence drift with you. Our 29th lost land is one that a scientist invented for entirely respectable reasons, and then completely lost control of. In 1864, an English zoologist named Philip Sclater published a paper about the mammals of Madagascar, and he was troubled by a puzzle. Lemurs and lemur-like fossils turned up in Madagascar and in India, but not in the intervening parts of Africa or the Middle East. This made no sense, unless, Sclater proposed, there had once been a land mass connecting them, since sunk. He suggested calling it Lemuria, land of the lemurs. It was, for its time, a perfectly reasonable hypothesis, because plate tectonics did not yet exist as an idea. Continents were assumed to stay put, so if animals had crossed, land must have sunk. 30th fact, And this is the twist. Lemuria escaped into mysticism almost immediately. Occultists adopted it as a lost continent of spiritually advanced beings. A separate lost continent, Mu, was invented in the Pacific by an eccentric named Augustus Le Plongeon, and then popularized in the 1920s by a British writer, James Churchward, who claimed to have read about it on secret tablets shown to him by an Indian priest. Neither the tablets nor the priest were ever produced, and yet Mu is still, a century later, cited with total confidence in 1,000 places online. But here's the part that makes me smile, and it's our 31st fact. Sclater was wrong about the mechanism, but he was pointing at something real. In 2013 and again in 2017, geologists studying Mauritius found zircon crystals in the island's beach sand and lavas that were vastly older than the island itself. Some dated to around 3 billion years, when Mauritius is only about 9 million years old. The interpretation is that fragments of ancient continental crust lie buried beneath the Indian Ocean, remnants of a drowned microcontinent that has been given the name Mauritia, torn apart as India and Madagascar separated. So there is, in a manner of speaking, a lost continent under the Indian Ocean after all. It just isn't full of lemur people. It's a sliver of very old rock, sitting quietly beneath the lava, waiting for someone to notice it. Now, let's go north and cold, because there is a lost country under the North Sea, and it may be the most emotionally strange fact in this entire episode. 32. Between Britain and Denmark, where ferries cross and oil rigs stand, there was once dry land, thousands of square kilometers of it. River valleys, marshes, woodland, lakes, hills. It has been named Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, and people lived there, hunted there, buried their dead there, for thousands of years after the last ice age, when sea levels were far lower and the water was locked up in glaciers. It was not a land bridge in the thin sense of a crossing. It was the Heartland. Britain was the peninsula on the edge of it. 33. We know this largely because of fishermen. For decades, North Sea trawlers have dragged up bones, mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, red deer, aurochs, in their nets, along with worked flint. The most celebrated single find came in 1931, when a trawler called the Kalinda hauled up a lump of peat from the seabed, and the skipper broke it open to find a barbed antler point inside. A hunting harpoon, made by a human being, roughly 8,000 to 12,000 years old, lying beneath 100 feet of water. The archaeologist Brian E. Coles gave the drowned landscape its modern name in the 1990s, and seismic survey data collected by oil companies has since been used to map its rivers and coastlines in remarkable detail. There are people alive today who can show you a map of a country nobody has walked on for 8,000 years. And 34 is how it ended, or at least how it was finished off. Around 8,150 years ago, a colossal underwater landslide occurred off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, in which an enormous section of the continental shelf let go and slid into the deep. It generated a tsunami that struck the coasts of Scotland, Norway, and the low-lying remnants of Doggerland. Deposits from that wave have been found in Scottish sediment, and on Shetland, many meters above the shoreline. By then, rising seas had already reduced Doggerland to islands. The wave and the water that kept coming finished the job. So the next time you look at a map of the North Sea, know that you are looking at the roof of a country. Let that settle. There's no rush. 35 brings us to the Celtic West, and to a set of stories that are almost certainly not literally true, and yet keep turning out to be built on something. Off the far southwest tip of England, between Land's End and the Isles of Scilly, tradition places a drowned land called Lyonesse, a fertile country with 140 churches, swallowed by the sea in a single night. Local families claimed descent from survivors. One legend has a man named Trevelyan outriding the flood on a white horse. Fishermen said they hauled up masonry in their nets, and that on quiet nights you could hear church bells under the water. And 36. The geology is not entirely unfriendly to the tale. The Isles of Scilly were, in the not-so-distant past, far more connected than they are now. Much of the shallow sandy flats between the islands was dry or marshy land within the last few thousand years, and field walls and hut circles have been recorded below the modern high-water mark. Nobody serious thinks 140 churches sank overnight, but people in Cornwall have been watching land go under for a very long time, and they built a story around the watching. 37 is the Welsh version, and it's better because it has a villain. Cantre'r Gwaelod, the Lowland Hundred, is said to have lain in what is now Cardigan Bay, protected from the sea by dikes and sluice gates. In the best-known telling, the gatekeeper, a man named Scythanen, was drunk at a feast and failed to close the sluices before a storm surge. 16 villages drowned. And here is the detail that makes people go quiet. After severe storms in 2014 stripped the sand from the beach at Borth, on the Welsh coast, the sea exposed the stumps of an ancient submerged forest, hundreds of oak, pine, and birch trunks, preserved in peat, thousands of years old, standing where they grew when the water was lower. People walked out among them at low tide and photographed a drowned wood. The story of Cantre'r Gwaelod is a legend. The forest is not. 38 takes us across to Brittany and the city of Ys, said to have been built below sea level behind a great dike, ruled by King Gradlon, whose daughter Dahut held the key to the sea gates on a chain around her neck, and, one wild night, gave it away. The waters came in. Gradlon fled on horseback. In the harshest versions of the tale, he lets his daughter fall into the sea to save himself. There's an old Breton pun in this, and I love it. It's said that when Ys rises again, Paris will sink, because para means like Ys. Whether that's authentic tradition or a 19th century flourish, I couldn't tell you. But someone thought of it, and it stuck. And 39 for the Baltic, the city of Vineta, a wealthy trading port said to have been drowned for the sins of its merchants, hunted for centuries along the German and Polish coasts. The candidates cluster around the island of Wolin, where a genuinely large early medieval trading settlement did exist and did decline. Every coastline seems to need one of these. A rich town, a moral failure, a wall of water. It is one of the oldest stories humans tell, and it may simply be the shape our memory takes when the sea moves in slowly over generations, and we need a reason. But now, let's talk about a drowned town that is absolutely, verifiably real, and that was found, recently, with sonar. Our 40th fact takes us to the North Frisian coast of Germany, to a date that people in that part of the world still speak about, with a kind of shiver. The 16th of January, 1362. A storm surge came out of the North Sea that has come to be called the Grote Mandrenke, the Great Drowning of Men. It tore the coastline apart. estimates of the dead run into the tens of thousands, and among the places it took was a prosperous trading settlement called Rungholt, which for centuries afterwards existed in a kind of half-world. Local people insisted it had been there, insisted that you could sometimes hear its bells beneath the mudflats, and scholars often dismissed the whole thing as folklore with a moral attached. The usual story of a rich town punished for its arrogance. There's even a famous German poem about it, written in the 19th century, in which the townsfolk taunt the sea, shouting defiance at Blanke Hans, the white-haired sea, the night before it kills them. 41. And this is the part that gives me goosebumps. Rungholt is real, and we have found it. Working across the tidal flats near the Hallig of Sudfall, teams of German researchers using magnetometers, seismic sensors, and coring have mapped a whole buried landscape out there in the mud. Dwelling mounds, drainage systems, a harbor, and, announced in 2023, the foundations of a large church, roughly 40 meters by 15, sitting under the sediment where the sea has been washing over it for 660 years. The bells are a legend. The church is a floor plan. 42. England has its own version, and this one had members of Parliament. Ravensor Odd was a town built on a shifting sandbank at the mouth of the Humber, and in the 13th century it was booming, chartered as a borough in 1299, with a market, a harbor, warehouses, its own courts, and the right to send 2 representatives to Parliament. It was aggressive, too. It poached trade from nearby Grimsby with a cheerful ruthlessness. And then the sea began taking it back. The Chronicle of Moabbey records, with real horror, the water reaching the churchyard and the bodies of the dead being washed out of their graves so that they had to be gathered up and reburied elsewhere. By the time the storms of 1362 had finished, Ravensor Odd was gone. Marine archaeologists have been surveying the estuary in recent years, looking for it with sonar. A parliamentary borough under the mud of the Humber. 43. And if you want to see how violently a coastline can rearrange itself, consider the island of Strand, off Schleswig-Holstein. It was a large, inhabited, prosperous island, and on the 11th of October, 1634, another catastrophic storm surge, the Burchardie flood, tore it into pieces in a single night. Thousands died. What remained became the separate islands and Halligen you can visit today, including Nordstrand and Pellworm. An island did not sink into the sea so much as it was shredded, and the fragments were given new names, and life went on among them. 44. Those Halligen deserve a moment of their own, because they are, to my mind, one of the most remarkable ways human beings have ever chosen to live. They are small, low, unembanked islands in the North Frisian Wadden Sea. They are not protected by full sea walls. Instead, the houses are built on artificial earth mounds called wharften, and several times a year, sometimes 10 or 20 times a year, the sea simply comes across the island. The locals have a phrase for it: land unter, land underneath. The grass disappears, the roads disappear, and the farms sit on their mounds like little ships in a gray field of water, waiting for the tide to remember itself and go away again. People have lived this way for centuries. They don't fight the flood. They just build higher and wait. Sit with that image for a while as you're lying there. A house on a hill in the middle of the sea, with the water going quietly past the door, and everyone inside going about their evening. Pause. Now let's turn the temperature up, because the sea is not the only thing that takes islands away. 1845, Krakatoa, on the 26th and 27th of August, 1883, a volcanic island in the strait between Java and Sumatra destroyed itself. The eruption removed roughly 2/3 of the island, and the numbers attached to it are so extreme that they sound invented until you check them. The final explosions were heard nearly 5,000 kilometers away on the island of Rodriguez, near Mauritius, where a police chief reported what he took to be the distant firing of heavy guns. That is the equivalent of an explosion in London being heard in Baghdad. The pressure wave circled the entire planet several times and was recorded on barographs in cities that had no idea what had happened. The official death toll from the Dutch authorities was 36,417. The overwhelming majority killed not by fire or ash, but by tsunamis that swept the coastal villages of the strait. 46. What I find most striking about Krakatoa, though, is what happened next, and it took 44 years. In 1927, fishermen reported steam and debris rising from the sea where the island had been. A new cone was building itself in the drowned caldera. It broke the surface and was named Anak Krakatau, the child of Krakatoa, and it grew. Through the 20th century, it rose steadily, a few meters a year, until it stood over 300 meters high, a black cone with a lively temper and a small forest creeping up its flanks. An island rebuilding itself in a single human lifetime, in plain view, with people taking photographs of it the whole way. 47. And then, on the 22nd of December, 2018, most of it fell into the sea. A large section of the southwestern flank collapsed during an eruption. The mountain simply let go, and the collapse displaced enough water to generate a tsunami that struck the coasts of Java and Sumatra without any earthquake warning, at night, with no time to react. More than 400 people were killed. When the ash cleared and the surveys were done, Anak Krakatau had gone from around 330 meters in height to roughly 110. 9 decades of patient construction, undone in minutes, and it has begun growing again since. It will keep doing this. That is simply what that place is. 48. Just to the east, in 1815, Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa produced the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history, so large that it cooled the entire planet and gave Europe and North America the year without a summer in 1816, with snow in June and failed harvests and food riots. But here's the detail that belongs in tonight's episode. Tambora didn't only kill people. It erased a culture. There was a small kingdom on the volcano's flanks, also called Tambora, with its own language, a language which linguists believe may not have been related to the Austronesian languages spoken all around it, which would make it a genuine anomaly in that part of the world. The eruption buried it. Everything we have of that language is a short word list, collected by a European visitor before the mountain went off. An entire way of speaking, held now in a page of vocabulary. 49 takes us to the Mediterranean, and to my favorite piece of diplomatic farce in the history of geology. In July of 1831, off the southwest coast of Sicily, the sea began to boil, and within days a volcanic island rose out of the water. It grew to perhaps 60 meters high and several hundred meters across. And immediately, everybody wanted it. The British sent a naval officer to plant a flag and named it Ghoramara Island, after the First Lord of the Admiralty. The kingdom of the two Sicilies claimed it and called it Ferdinandea, after their king, Ferdinand II. The French sent a geologist, planted their own flag, and named it Julia, after the month of its birth. Spain, by some accounts, also took an interest. 4 powers, one small pile of warm volcanic scree, and an escalating dispute conducted with total seriousness. 50. And the island solved the problem itself. It was made of loose, crumbly volcanic material, and the Mediterranean simply washed it away. By the beginning of 1832, within about 6 months of its appearance, Graham Island, or Ferdinandea, or Julia, had eroded back below the waterline. It is still there, a few meters beneath the surface, and it has stirred more than once since. In 2000, when there were signs of renewed activity and talk that it might resurface, a group of Sicilian divers went down and fixed a marble plaque to the summit, preemptively claiming it for Sicily should it ever come back. That is a very Sicilian solution, and I admire it enormously. 51 is the smaller, sadder Atlantic version. In June of 1811, off the coast of São Miguel in the Azores, an underwater eruption produced a new island. The commander of a British warship, HMS Sabrina, went ashore, hoisted the flag, and named the island after his ship. Within a few months, it had washed away entirely. Somewhere in the naval records of the Royal Navy, there's a formal claim of sovereignty over a place that lasted less than a season. 52, and now the opposite. An island that appeared and stayed, and that we were lucky enough to watch from the very first minute. Early on the 14th of November, 1963, the crew of a fishing trawler called the Ísleifur II, working off the southern coast of Iceland, noticed something strange in the water before dawn. The cook, a man named Olafur Vestman, was the first to see it. Smoke, they thought, or a boat on fire. They steered closer. It was the sea itself, erupting. Within a day there was a cone of ash above the waves. Within a week there was an island. It was named Surtsey, after Surtur, the fire giant of Norse mythology, who is prophesied to burn the world at the end of days. 53. And then the Icelanders did something quietly brilliant. They closed it. Surtsey was protected almost immediately in 1965, and access has been restricted ever since to a small number of scientists, because a brand new sterile island rising from the sea in the middle of the 20th century is the most extraordinary natural laboratory imaginable. For 60 years now, researchers have documented arrival by arrival how life colonizes bare volcanic rock, seeds washed ashore, the first moss, the first vascular plant in 1965, the first nesting seabirds whose droppings changed the soil chemistry and made everything else possible, the first earthworm. There's a famous embarrassment in the island's history. At one point in the 1970s, a tomato plant was discovered growing there, and after some awkward investigation, it was traced not to a passing seabird, but to a member of a scientific party relieving himself. The plant was destroyed. 54. Surtsey also had siblings, and they didn't make it. The same volcanic episode produced 2 other islands nearby, one named Surtlingur, one named Jolner, and both of them rose from the sea in the mid-1960s, existed for a matter of months, and were then eroded away completely by the North Atlantic. And Surtsey itself is shrinking. It peaked at around 2.7 square kilometers and has lost roughly half of that to the waves. The current estimates suggest that most of it will be gone within a century or 2, leaving perhaps a resistant core of hardened tuff. We will very likely be able to say of an entire island exactly when it was born and roughly when it died, and to have photographs of both. 55 belongs to Tonga and to an island that seems genuinely unable to decide. Vanuatu, known to European charts as Falcon Island, has appeared and disappeared repeatedly since the 1800s. It surfaces after an eruption, sometimes rising well above the waves and lasting for years, long enough to be surveyed and claimed and written about. And then the sea wears it down, and it slips under again, and the charts have to be redrawn once more. Tonga formally annexed it during one of its appearances. There is something wonderfully stubborn about a nation claiming sovereignty over a place that keeps leaving. 56. And Tonga is also where the most violent volcanic event of the modern satellite era took place. 2 small islands, Hunga Tonga and Hunga Ha'apai, were joined together by an eruption in 2014 and 15, forming a single new landmass that scientists were delighted to study, since it gave them a rare chance to watch a young volcanic island stabilize. Then, on the 15th of January, 2022, that volcano erupted with a force that stunned everyone watching. The plume punched up to around 57 kilometers into the mesosphere, the highest volcanic plume ever recorded by instruments. The atmospheric shock wave circled the globe multiple times and was picked up by barometers everywhere on Earth. The blast was heard in Alaska, nearly 10,000 kilometers away. It severed Tonga's undersea communications cable and cut the country off from the world for weeks. 57. And this is the detail that scientists still find astonishing. Because the vent was underwater at just the right depth, the eruption injected an enormous mass of seawater into the stratosphere, on the order of 146 teragrams of water vapor, enough to increase the total stratospheric water content by something like 10%. It was, in a real sense, an eruption of water. And the island that had been so carefully studied, almost all of it was blown away. What had been a promising new landmass was reduced, in a few hours, to 2 small remnants of the original islands, sitting on either side of a hole in the sea. 58 goes the other direction. About 1,000 kilometers south of Tokyo lies a tiny remote Japanese island called Nishinoshima. In 1973, an eruption created a new islet beside it. Then, from November 2013, it began erupting again, and this time the new lava didn't just sit alongside the old island. It grew and grew and eventually swallowed the original Nishinoshima completely, burying it under fresh rock. The island today is many times its former size. It is a place that ate its own past. And, like Surtsey, it is now watched closely by biologists, tracking how seabirds and insects and plants take possession of brand new land. 59. Islands can also arrive with very little ceremony. In September 2022, a volcano called Home Reef, again in Tongan waters, put a small island above the surface within hours of erupting. It has come and gone before, and will likely do so again. And 60. In 2013, after a powerful earthquake struck Balochistan in Pakistan, an island simply popped up off the coast near Gwadar. Locals walked out to it and stood on it and took photographs of themselves on newly minted land. It was called Zalzala Ko, Earthquake Mountain. It was not volcanic in the ordinary sense. It was a mud volcano, a burp of gas and sediment squeezed up through the seabed by the shock. And because it was made of mud, the Arabian Sea took it apart with no difficulty at all. Within a few years it had washed away entirely. 61 is a strange one for a sleepy night, but I can't leave it out. In the Solomon Islands, there is a submarine volcano called Kavachi, which erupts so frequently that it has built temporary islands above the waterline at least 8 or 9 times since the 1930s, only for each of them to be eroded away. In 2015, a scientific team dropped cameras into the crater during a quiet phase, expecting to find a sterile, superheated, acidic wasteland. Instead, the cameras found fish, and then they found sharks, hammerheads and silky sharks, cruising around inside the crater of an active volcano, in water that should by all reason be uninhabitable. The researchers, with admirable restraint, called it Sharkino, and admitted they had no good explanation for what those animals do when the volcano goes off. Let that one sit with you, somewhere, right now, in the dark, in warm, acidic water. A shark is swimming in circles inside a volcano. If you're drifting, drift. Pause. Now, I want to change the mood, because so far the islands we've lost have mostly been lost to deep time, or to fire, or to somebody's honest mistake. The next stretch of our journey is different. These are islands going now, in our lifetimes, slowly enough that you can watch it happen, and fast enough that people have had to pack. 62. In the Sundarbans, the vast tidal mangrove delta, where the Ganges and the Brahmaputra empty into the Bay of Bengal, shared between India and Bangladesh, there was an island called Lohachara. People lived there, farmed there, and, over the course of a few decades, through a combination of rising seas, subsidence, and the ferocious erosion of a delta that is starved of the sediment it used to receive, the island went under. Researchers at Jadavpur University in Kolkata, who have monitored the delta for years, reported it as effectively gone. Thousands of people from Lohachara and its neighbors became, in the language of a newer century, climate refugees, though most of them would simply have said they lost their land. 63. And this is where geography and politics collide in a way that would be funny if it weren't so serious. After the catastrophic Bola cyclone of 1970, a small sandbar island emerged in the mouth of the Haryabanga River, right on the frontier between India and Bangladesh. India called it New Moor Island. Bangladesh called it South Talpati. It was uninhabited, roughly 2 square kilometers at most, and it mattered enormously, because whoever owned it could redraw the maritime boundary and the seabed rights that came with it. In 1981, India sent a naval vessel and planted a flag. Diplomats argued about it for decades. 64. And in March of 2010, researchers announced that the argument was over because the island wasn't there anymore. Satellite imagery showed open water. The sea had settled the dispute that 2 nations had been unable to settle themselves, and it had done it without a single meeting. Think about that for a second. A border argument concluded by the quiet erasure of the thing being argued about. 65. Nearby, the island of Ghoramara is still inhabited and still going. It has lost a very large share of its land area since the 1970s, and its population has fallen by thousands as families give up and move to the mainland or to the neighboring island of Sagar. Journalists visit and photograph the same thing every few years. A house at the edge of a crumbling bank, a family carrying a door and a bed frame and a cooking pot along a path, a school that used to be in the middle of the village and is now on the shore. The people there talk about it in terms of specific fields and specific mango trees. Not the island is shrinking. Rather, The water took my father's plot in '94, and the pond in 2008. 66 takes us into the Pacific, to the Republic of Kiribati, a nation of 33 atolls scattered across an area of ocean larger than India, with an average elevation of only a couple of meters. In 1999, researchers reported that 2 uninhabited islets in the Kiribati chain, named Tebua Tarawa and Abanuea, had disappeared beneath the waves. The name Abanuea in the local language means roughly the beach which is long-lasting. Let that irony land gently. It's not a joke. It was a hopeful name, given by people who expected the beach to outlast them. 67. In 2014, Kiribati's government, under President Anote Tong, did something no country had done for this reason before. It bought land in another country. About 20 square kilometers on Vanuatu, one of the larger islands of Fiji, purchased for roughly $8.5 million. Officially, it was described as an investment in food security, but Tong spoke openly about what it also was, a place to go if it came to that. He used a phrase that has stayed with me ever since I first read it. He said the goal was migration with dignity, not evacuation, not refuge, dignity. 68. Kiribati's neighbor Tuvalu has gone further still, and this is one of the most extraordinary things happening on Earth right now. Tuvalu is 9 atolls, about 11,000 people, and at its highest natural point it is roughly 5 meters above the sea. In 2021, its foreign minister, Simon Kofe, recorded an address to the World Climate Conference standing at a lectern in a suit, knee-deep in seawater on what had been dry land. The following year, he went further, announcing that Tuvalu would begin creating a digital version of itself, mapping its islands, archiving its songs, its histories, its administrative records, its land registries, so that the nation could continue to exist legally and culturally, even if the physical territory becomes uninhabitable, a country with a backup. 69, and this is the part that has moved fastest. In 2023, Australia and Tuvalu signed a treaty called the Falapili Union, Falapili being a Tuvaluan concept of good neighborliness, of the duty of care between people who live close together. It created something genuinely new in international law, a permanent migration pathway explicitly framed by the existential threat of climate change. Up to 280 Tuvaluan citizens a year can move permanently to Australia, with the right to live, work, and study there, and to travel freely home again. The first ballot opened in June 2025. By the time it closed in July, over 5,000 people had applied, around half the population of the entire country in a matter of weeks. Sit with that a moment, because it's a strange and heavy thing. Half a nation entering a lottery, not to win money, but to have somewhere to stand. 70. It isn't only distant atolls. In the bayous of southern Louisiana, there is a narrow ridge of land called Ile de Jean Charles, home for generations to a community with Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw roots, people whose ancestors, in many tellings, moved into that remote marsh precisely because it was somewhere the government would leave them alone. Since the mid-1950s, the island has lost something in the order of 98% of its land. Some of that is sea level rise. Much of it is subsidence, and the canals cut through the marsh for oil and gas access, which let salt water in and killed the vegetation whose roots held the ground together. In 2016, the state received a federal grant of around $48 million to relocate the community inland, described at the time as one of the first federally funded relocations of an entire community in the United States for climate-related reasons. Families began moving to the new site some years later, and the process was, as you might expect, complicated and painful, and full of arguments about who counted as a resident, and what is owed, and whether a place can be moved at all, or whether what gets moved is only the people. 71. Further north, in Chesapeake Bay, there was an island called Holland Island. In 1910, it had around 360 residents, a school, shops, a church, a baseball team, a doctor. The island was made of soft silt and clay, and the bay simply took it from the west side year after year. Families gave up and left. Some of them dismantled their houses and floated them to the mainland to be rebuilt. By the late 20th century, only one house remained, a handsome two-story Victorian standing alone in the water, and it became a famous photograph. A beautiful house on a shrinking scrap of grass, surrounded by open bay. A retired minister named Stephen White bought the island and spent years and a great deal of his own money trying to save that house with sandbags and stone and sheer stubbornness. In October of 2010, it fell down. 72. It has plenty of company. Sharp's Island, in the same bay, covered around 700 acres in the mid-1800s and had farms and, at one point, a hotel. It is now entirely gone. Only its lighthouse remains, and that lighthouse leans at an angle, because ice shoved it out of True in 1977, and nobody has straightened it since. There are dozens of named islands in the Chesapeake that have vanished within recorded American history. A whole archipelago of former places, remembered mostly in old survey maps and family names. 73. And still inhabited, still holding on, is Tangier Island in Virginia. A few hundred people. A distinctive local dialect that linguists have studied for its old-fashioned vowels, a crabbing economy, and a shoreline that has been retreating for as long as anyone can remember. Studies have suggested the island could become uninhabitable within decades. The residents are famously divided on why it's happening. Their mayor has been quoted more than once saying he sees erosion, not sea level rise. What nobody on Tangier disputes is that the land is going. They can walk you to the spots where houses used to be, and where the old graves were, and point at the water. 74 is small and quiet, and I love it. In 2018, an author in Japan was researching a book about remote islands, and went to visit a tiny islet off the northern coast of Hokkaido called Isanbe Hanakita Kojima. It was one of the hundreds of small islands Japan had surveyed and named in the 20th century, partly because such islets help define territorial waters. Only, when he asked the local fishermen to take him there, they told him it wasn't there anymore. Surveys followed. The islet, which had stood only a meter or so above the waves, appears to have been worn away by ice and erosion, unnoticed over years. Nobody had reason to check. A country of 125 million people quietly lost a piece of itself, and found out because one writer wanted to see it. 75. In October 2018, a hurricane named Walaka passed through the remote northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and when researchers looked at the satellite imagery afterwards, East Island, an 11-acre spit of sand and gravel in French frigate shoals, was gone, erased in a single storm. It mattered far beyond its size. It was one of the most important nesting sites in the region for Hawaiian green sea turtles, and a haul-out for critically endangered Hawaiian monk seals. Sand islands like that can rebuild, and portions of it have since reappeared in shifting form. But for the animals whose whole reproductive calendar depended on that specific piece of sand in that specific season, the storm was not a statistic. And 76, because I don't want to leave you with a story that's simpler than the truth. Not every low island is shrinking. A New Zealand-based coastal geomorphologist named Paul Kench and his colleagues published work looking at over 100 islands in Tuvalu, across 4 decades of aerial and satellite imagery, and found that a majority of them had actually remained stable or grown in land area, because coral atolls are not inert lumps of rock. They are made of the broken skeletons of living reefs, and waves and storms keep pushing that material up onto the islands. A healthy reef feeds its island. So the picture is genuinely more complicated than the islands are sinking. The land may persist. What is far less clear is whether it can persist in a shape people can live on, with fresh groundwater, with soil, with room for a village and an airstrip, while the reefs that make the sand are themselves under stress from warming and acidification. An island that survives as a bare shifting bank of rubble has, in every sense that matters to a family, still been lost. Let that settle for a moment. Then let's go somewhere colder and quieter and much more empty. Pause, because some islands aren't taken. Some are simply left. 77. 40 miles out into the Atlantic beyond the Outer Hebrides of Scotland lies St. Kilda, a cluster of islands with the highest sea cliffs in Britain, wrapped in weather, home to 1 million seabirds. And for something like 2,000 years, people lived there. Not visitors. Residents on the main island of Hirta in a single street of houses, with a way of life built almost entirely around birds. They climbed the cliffs barefoot on ropes of horsehair to take fulmars and gannets. They ate them, rendered their oil, used their feathers to pay the rent. They stored everything in small stone huts called cleats, hundreds of which still stand across the hillsides like scattered beehives. Every morning the men gathered informally to decide the day's work, and visitors, half joking, called it the St. Kilda Parliament. 78. And I have to tell you the darkest thread of that story, because it explains a great deal. For roughly a century and a half, St. Kilda suffered a catastrophic rate of infant death. By some accounts, the majority of newborns died within about 8 days of birth. The islanders called it the 8-day sickness. It was almost certainly neonatal tetanus, and the most persuasive explanation involves the traditional practice of dressing the newborn's severed umbilical cord with fulmar oil, stored in vessels that were not sterile. A community keeping itself alive on seabirds was, without any way of knowing it, killing its own children with the same birds. When the practice changed, the deaths largely stopped, but the damage to the population had been done over generations. 79. By the 1920s, St. Kilda was failing. Young people had emigrated. Illness had come in with tourist steamers. The old economy of feathers and oil had collapsed. After a difficult winter and the death of a young woman who could not be evacuated in time for medical care, the remaining islanders themselves petitioned the government to be taken off. And on the 29th of August, 1930, 36 people, the entire remaining population, boarded a naval vessel, HMS Harebell, and left. Before going, by the accounts that have come down to us, they put out the fires, left a small offering of oats in each house, and set an open Bible on the table in every home. Their dogs, which could not come, were drowned in the bay. The sheep were taken off later. The street is still there. The cleats are still there. Nobody has lived on Hirta permanently since. 80. Ireland has its own version, and it produced literature. The Great Blasket Island off the Dingle Peninsula was a wholly Irish-speaking community, with no shop, no priest, no doctor, and no pub. And in the early 20th century it produced an astonishing burst of writing. Memoirs by islanders like Tomás Ó Criomhthain and Pig Sayers and Muiris Ó Suiliabhain that became cornerstones of modern Irish literature. Ó Criomhthain wrote a line that everyone in Ireland knows, that the likes of them would never be seen again. He was right. The population dwindled. The young left for America. And after a young man died of meningitis when bad weather prevented anyone reaching the mainland for help, the government moved the last 24 or so residents to the mainland in November 1953. The island is empty now, except for summer wardens and rabbits and seals, and the roofless houses look down at the same water. 81. Now come with me to the other end of the world and the other extreme of density. Off the coast of Nagasaki in Japan, there is a small island, officially Hashima, universally known as Gunkanjima, Battleship Island, because from a distance, with its seawall and its rows of gray concrete towers, that is exactly what it looks like. It was a coal mine, with shafts running out under the seabed, and to house the workers, Mitsubishi built high-rise concrete apartment blocks on it. Japan's first large reinforced concrete buildings, put up in 1916. At its peak, in 1959, more than 5,000 people lived on roughly 6.5 hectares. It has been described as, for a time, the most densely populated place on Earth. There was a school, a hospital, a cinema, shops, a rooftop garden, a shrine. There were also, during the war years, Korean and Chinese laborers brought there under conditions that are still a source of real diplomatic friction, and that dispute shadowed the island's inscription as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2015. 82. And then Japan switched from coal to oil, and the mine became uneconomic, and in January 1974, Mitsubishi announced the closure. Within 3 months, everybody was gone. Not slowly, not over a generation. The entire island emptied in weeks. Furniture left behind. Televisions, toys, school desks. And then 35 years of typhoons went to work on it. When Hashima was partially reopened to visitors in 2009, what they found was one of the most complete accidental ruins of the modern age. Concrete stairwells full of rubble, a nursery with its walls peeled back, apartment blocks collapsing floor into floor. It is a genuinely disquieting place to look at photographs of, and I recommend it right before you fall asleep only if you're the sort of person who finds ruins comforting. Some of us are. 83. There is an island in the Venetian lagoon called Poveglia, and it is empty for reasons that have accumulated in layers. It served as a quarantine station, a lazaretto, for ships arriving in Venice, in an age when plague came in on the rigging, and the dead of those quarantines were buried there. In the 20th century, a hospital was built on it, which by most accounts operated for decades as a home for the elderly and the mentally ill, and closed in the 1960s. Since then, it has been abandoned. Shuttered buildings, a bell tower, an overgrown courtyard, and a great deal of lurid folklore about screaming and haunted asylums, most of which is invention layered on top of a real and rather sadder history. What's genuinely interesting is what has happened lately. In 2014, the Italian state auctioned a long lease on the island, and the winning bid, around €500,000 from a Venetian businessman, ultimately came to nothing. And then, a citizens' association of ordinary Venetians, tired of watching their lagoon sold to hotel developers, campaigned and crowdfunded to win a concession over part of it themselves, with the idea of turning it into a public park. An abandoned plague island, reclaimed not by a resort, but by a neighborhood group. 84. New York City has one too, and hardly anyone has ever set foot on it. North Brother Island sits in the East River between the Bronx and Rikers, and it is closed to the public. It was a quarantine hospital, Riverside Hospital, for smallpox, then typhus, then tuberculosis. Its most famous resident was Mary Mallon, remembered by a nickname she loathed, Typhoid Mary. She was an Irish-born cook, an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid, who infected people in the household she worked for, and who refused, understandably and disastrously, to believe that she could be dangerous while feeling perfectly well. She was confined to the island, released on condition she never cook again, resumed cooking under a false name, and was returned to North Brother, where she lived alone in a small cottage for the last 23 years of her life and died in 1938. 85. And in 1904, the worst disaster in New York's history before the 11th of September happened on that island's shore. A steamboat called the General Slocum, carrying more than 1,000 people, mostly women and children from a German-American church picnic, caught fire in the East River. The fire hoses were rotten. The life jackets were rotten. The captain, catastrophically, ran for North Brother Island instead of the nearer shore. More than 1,000 people died within sight of the hospital, and nurses and patients waded into the water pulling out survivors and bodies. The island was later a veterans' housing site, then a drug rehabilitation center, and since the 1960s it has been abandoned entirely and allowed to grow wild. It is now a protected heron rookery. New York, with all its pressure for land, has left one island to the birds and the ruins, and you cannot go there. 86 takes us as far south as people go. Deception Island, off the Antarctic Peninsula, is the flooded caldera of an active volcano, a horseshoe of black rock with a narrow gap in one side, so ships can sail directly into the crater and anchor in warm, steaming water. In the early 20th century, it was a whaling station. At Whalers Bay, Norwegian crews rendered oil in enormous iron boilers, and the beach was heaped with bones. That operation shut in the early 1930s. Later, Britain, Chile, and Argentina all placed bases there. And then, in 1967 and again in 1969, the volcano erupted. Ash buried the buildings. A mud flow tore through the British base. The stations were evacuated and never fully re-established. What's left is one of the strangest sights on Earth. Rusting boilers and collapsed wooden huts, and a cemetery mostly buried under volcanic mud, on a warm, black beach inside a volcano in Antarctica, with penguins walking through it. 87. Not far away on South Georgia is Grytviken, the whaling station where the modern history of the Southern Ocean was written in the worst possible ink. At its height, it processed thousands of whales. It closed in December 1965, and its workers left behind a church, a cinema, workshops, oil tanks, and a graveyard. In that graveyard is the grave of Ernest Shackleton, who died there of a heart attack in 1922 at the beginning of another expedition, and whose wife asked that he be buried on the island rather than brought home. Visitors still stop there and, by tradition, drink a toast. A ghost town at the bottom of the world, with the greatest survival story in polar history buried at the end of it. 88 is an evacuation that ended in one of the strangest votes ever held. Tristan da Cunha is the most remote inhabited island on the planet, a volcanic cone in the South Atlantic, roughly 2,500 kilometers from the nearest other inhabited land. In October of 1961, the volcano everyone had assumed was extinct began to erupt directly behind the settlement. The entire population, 260-odd people, was evacuated. First to nearby Nightingale Island in small boats, then by ship to Cape Town, and finally to England, where they were housed in an old military camp in Hampshire. And Britain, in the way Britain does, was delighted with them. Newspapers ran features on the islanders as a lost pastoral people. Doctors studied them. Everyone assumed they would settle down and stay. 89. They hated it. They found the noise and the crime and the crowding and the modern hurry unbearable, and many of them fell ill with respiratory infections they had no immunity to. In 1962, a survey party found the settlement damaged but survivable. The lava had stopped short of the houses. And in 1963, the islanders voted on whether to return. The result was overwhelming, something like 148 in favor, 5 against. They went home. They are still there. Given the choice between the most remote inhabited island on Earth, with an active volcano behind it, and the modern world, they chose the volcano, and I think about that more often than you'd expect. If you're still with me, we're moving now into the part of the night where things get quieter and stranger, and rather harder to explain. Pause. 90. Clipperton Island is an atoll in the eastern Pacific, about 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Mexico, a ring of coral around a stagnant lagoon, with one volcanic rock sticking up at one end, and almost nothing growing on it but coconut palms and crabs. In the early 1900s, Mexico maintained a small garrison there to defend its claim, under a captain named Ramon Arnaud, who brought his wife Alicia, and there were soldiers and their families, and a lighthouse keeper. Supply ships came a few times a year. Then, the Mexican Revolution swallowed the country's attention, and the ships stopped coming. The colony ran out of food and began to die of scurvy. In 1914, Arnaud and several others rowed out to what they believed was a passing ship and were lost in the surf. What remained was a handful of women and children, and the lighthouse keeper, a man named Victoriano Alvarez, who had access to the colony's only firearms. 91. What happened over the following 2.5 years is genuinely appalling. Alvarez declared himself the king of the island and terrorized the survivors, and the accounts that came out afterwards describe murder and repeated assault. In July of 1917, the women killed him. And days later, an American warship, the USS Yorktown, appeared off the reef and took off the survivors, 4 women and a small group of children. That is the whole population of a nation's territorial colony, rescued after 3 years of total isolation, less than a week after the end of the worst part of it. Clipperton is uninhabited today, visited occasionally by scientists and radio operators, and it is administered by France. 92. and in a very different register. On the 28th of April, 1789, in the South Pacific, the crew of HMS Bounty mutinied. You know that part. What's less often told is what became of the mutineers. 9 of them, with a group of Tahitian men and women, some of whom went willingly, and some of whom, by most accounts, did not, sailed off looking for somewhere the Royal Navy would never find them. They chose Pitcairn Island, and the reason they chose it was a mistake in the charts. Pitcairn had been recorded in the wrong position by about 200 miles. They burned the Bounty in the bay on the 23rd of January, 1790, so no one could leave, and no passing ship would see her masts. Within a few years, the little settlement had torn itself apart in violence, and by the time the outside world stumbled on it, in 1808, when an American sealing captain named Mayhew Folger called in, only 1 adult mutineer was left alive, along with a community of women and children speaking a strange blend of English and Tahitian. Their descendants are there still. A cartographic error hid a colony for 18 years. Now let's have the ghost story, because you can't do an episode about lost islands without the lighthouse. 93. The Flannan Isles lie about 32 kilometers west of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides, uninhabited, steep-sided, treeless. In 1899, a lighthouse was completed on the largest of them, Island Moor, and it was manned by 3 keepers at a time, rotating on and off from the mainland. On the 15th of December, 1900, a passing steamer noticed that the light was not lit. Weather delayed the relief vessel. On the 26th of December, the tender Hesperus finally reached the island, and a relief keeper named Joseph Moore climbed the steps and found the door closed, the beds unmade, the kitchen clock stopped, and no one there at all. The 3 men, James Ducate, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, were gone. They were never found. 94. Here is what the investigation actually recorded, as opposed to what the legend says. The lamp was clean and filled, ready to be lit. 2 sets of oilskins were missing. 1 set remained on its hook, which suggested 1 man had gone outside in a hurry without stopping to dress for the weather. On the west landing, the damage was extraordinary. A supply box, fixed into the rock roughly 34 meters above sea level, had been torn away. Iron railings were buckled, and a block of stone weighing more than a ton had been shifted. The Northern Lighthouse Board superintendent concluded that the men had gone down to secure equipment at the landing during a storm and had been taken by an exceptional wave. 95, and this matters, because it shows you exactly how myths get built. Almost everything eerie in the popular version was added later. The story about a meal left half-eaten on the table, the overturned chair, the log entries describing the keepers weeping and praying. None of that is in the official record. Much of it flows from a poem published in 1912 by Wilfred Wilson Gibson, which is genuinely haunting, and which fix the fictional details in the public mind so firmly that they have been repeated as fact for 100 years. The truth is bleaker and simpler. 3 men, an enormous sea, and an island with nobody left on it to say what happened. 96. And the same is true, in a much larger way, of the most famous vanishing in the history of the English-speaking Americas. In 1587, a group of about 115 English colonists, men, women, and children, which is worth noting, because this was meant to be a settlement, not a fort, landed on Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Among them was a woman named Eleanor Dare, daughter of the colony's governor, John White, and on the 18th of August that year, she gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare. Supplies were short. White sailed back to England for more, expecting to return within months, and instead ran headlong into the Spanish Armada, which swallowed every available English ship for years. He got back on the 18th of August, 1590, his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, and the settlement was empty, not burned, not scattered with bodies, dismantled, the houses taken down, the place tidied and abandoned. Carved into a post of the palisade was a single word, Croatoan. On a nearby tree, the letters CRO. And here is the crucial part that most retellings leave out. Before he left, White had arranged a signal with the colonists. If they moved, they were to carve the name of their destination, and if they were leaving under attack, they were to add a cross above it. There was no cross. Croatoan was the name of an island to the south, and of the people who lived there, people the English had actual friendly contact with. The most obvious reading of the evidence has always been that the colonists went to live with their neighbors. White tried to sail there. A storm drove him off. His crew refused, and he never saw any of them again, and died in Ireland years later without knowing. Archaeological work in the region has turned up tantalizing European artifacts at native sites, and the argument continues. But the mystery is, in a sense, mostly ours. They may have known exactly where they were going. While we're on the subject of things found empty, in April of 1964, a South African survey team landed on Bouvet Island, the most remote island on Earth, a glacier-covered lump in the South Atlantic, more than 1,600 kilometers from Antarctica, and vastly further from anywhere inhabited, and found an abandoned lifeboat sitting in a lagoon. There were oars nearby. There were no bodies, no wreck, no markings that identified a vessel, and no distress call had ever been logged from that region. No one has ever established where it came from or what became of whoever wrote it there. That one, I'm afraid, has no tidy ending. It's just a boat on the loneliest beach in the world. 97. Rapa Nui, Easter Island, is not a lost island in the sense of being gone. It is right there, part of Chile, with an airport and hotels. But something was lost on it, and the story of what has been argued about more fiercely than almost anything in the Pacific archaeology. The islanders carved and moved nearly 900 enormous stone figures, the moai, some of them over 9 meters tall and weighing scores of tons, and transported them for kilometers across the island without draft animals or wheels. In the quarry at Rano Raraku, hundreds remain unfinished, still attached to the bedrock, as though everyone put down their tools at once and walked away. For decades, the standard account was a morality tale, a society that cut down its own forest to move its statues, ruined its soil, ran out of canoe timber, and collapsed into warfare and starvation. It's a compelling story, and it was told in best-selling books, and much of it is now seriously disputed. Researchers, including Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, have argued that the deforestation owed a great deal to the Polynesian rat, which arrived with the settlers and ate the palm seeds, and that the islanders were not collapsing, but adapting, farming ingeniously in rock gardens on a difficult island. What is not disputed, and what tends to get less attention than the statues, is what happened in the 1860s. Peruvian slave raiders took away well over 1,000 people, including much of the island's leadership and the few individuals who could read the island's script. and the survivors who were eventually returned brought smallpox home with them. Within a few years, the population of Rapa Nui had fallen to something like 111 people. And that is why nobody today can read Rongorongo, the island's system of carved glyphs, which survives on a couple of dozen wooden objects scattered in museums and remains undeciphered. It isn't that the knowledge faded. It was removed, in ships, in a single decade. Sit with that for a moment. And if you want a gentler companion image, on the island of Pohnpei, in Micronesia, there's a city called Nan Madol. 90-odd artificial islets built over a reef out of enormous basalt logs, some weighing dozens of tons laid up like timber into walls, a capital of a dynasty that ruled for centuries, and then, sometime in the 1600s, ended. The city was left to the mangroves. Nobody quite knows how the stones were moved. The local traditional explanation is that they were flown there by sorcery, which is at least as satisfying as any of the engineering theories. 98. Now, here is an island lost in the least likely way imaginable. Not because the water rose, but because it left. In the Aral Sea, on the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, there was an island called Vozrojdeniya, Rebirth Island. The Soviet Union chose it, precisely for its remoteness, as the site of a biological weapons testing facility, with a closed town called Kantubek, and a laboratory complex where pathogens including anthrax and plague were tested on animals in the open air. Then, the rivers that fed the Aral Sea were diverted for cotton irrigation, and the sea began to disappear. One of the fastest and most complete environmental collapses of the 20th century. As the water fell, the island grew, and around 2001, it stopped being an island at all. It joined the mainland, which meant that a bioweapons site chosen for being unreachable was now something you could walk to. American and Uzbek teams undertook a decontamination operation of the anthrax burial pits in 2002. The old town stands empty in what is now desert, with rusting ships stranded on sand many kilometers from any shoreline. An island can be lost by the sea arriving. It can also be lost by the sea being taken away. Let that settle over you, and let's move to the last of it now. There's not much further to go tonight. 99. In February of 1946, on a small atoll in the Marshall Islands, an American naval officer named Ben Wyatt came ashore after church and spoke to the people of Bikini through an interpreter. He asked them whether they would be willing to leave their islands temporarily so that the United States could test atomic bombs there for the good of mankind and to end all world wars. The leader of the community, a man remembered as King Judah, gave an answer that has been quoted ever since, that if the United States and the scientists of the world wanted to use their island, everything was in God's hands. On the 7th of March, 167 people were loaded onto a landing craft with their possessions and their dismantled church, and taken to Rongerik, an atoll they knew to be poor in food and water. Within 2 years, they were starving there and had to be moved again, and again after that. Over the next 12 years, the United States detonated 23 nuclear devices at Bikini and dozens more across the Marshall Islands. The largest was Castle Bravo on the 1st of March, 1954. A 15-megaton hydrogen bomb, which turned out to be roughly 2.5 times more powerful than the designers had predicted, because of a reaction in the lithium fuel they had assumed would be inert. It excavated a crater more than 1.5 kilometers across and threw a vast quantity of pulverized coral into the sky. And the wind that morning was not where it was supposed to be. Fallout, fine white ash, came down on the inhabited atolls of Rongelap and Uterik, on people who had not been warned and had no idea what it was. Children played in it. It looked like snow, which nobody there had ever seen. Within a day they were vomiting, their hair was falling out, their skin was burning. They were evacuated days later, and their health and their children's health has been a matter of medical study and legal argument ever since. The same fallout dusted a Japanese tuna boat called the Daigo Fukuryu Maru, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, 80 miles from the blast. Its 23 crew members fell ill on the voyage home. The radio operator, Aikichi Kuboyama, died that September, and his death, coming less than a decade after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, set off a wave of anti-nuclear feeling across Japan, so powerful that it changed the country's politics permanently. It also, in a roundabout way, gave the world Godzilla, a film released later that same year, which opens with a fishing boat destroyed by a blinding light on the horizon. And 2 islands were removed from the Earth entirely. The first was Elugalab, at Eniwetok Atoll, which was the ground zero of the world's first true hydrogen bomb test, Ivy Mike, on the 1st of November, 1952. When the survey ships returned, the island was gone. In its place was a crater in the reef, roughly 2 kilometers wide and 50 meters deep, filled with seawater. An island that had a name and a shape and coconut trees on it is now a hole in the lagoon. Afterwards, in the late 1970s, the United States undertook a cleanup at Eniwetok. Contaminated soil and debris were scraped up from around the atoll, mixed with concrete, and dumped into one of the craters left by an earlier test on Runit Island, some 85,000 cubic meters of it, and then capped with a dome of concrete panels, each about 45 centimeters thick. It is called the Runit Dome, and locally it is called the Tomb. The crater beneath it was never lined. The waste sits on porous coral. The dome has cracked with time and settlement, and the sea is rising around it. And there is now an ongoing and quite serious argument about what happens to that material in the coming decades. The people of Eniwetok were resettled on the atoll and are living beside it. The Marshall Islands were not the only place this happened. Britain vaporized a ship, HMS Plym, and blasted the Montebello Islands off Western Australia in 1952, and later tested at Christmas Island. France conducted well over 150 tests in French Polynesia between 1966 and 1996, at Mururoa and Fangataufa, honeycombing the atolls with shafts and, by many accounts, cracking Mururoa's structure. The protest ship Rainbow Warrior was bombed in Auckland Harbor by French agents in 1985 while preparing to sail there, killing a photographer named Fernando Pereira. The United States tested underground on Amchitka in the Aleutians, and the protest voyage that sailed against the last of those tests in 1971 was organized by a small group who called themselves the Don't Make a Wave Committee, and who shortly afterwards renamed themselves Greenpeace. And the Hawaiian island of Kaho'olawe was used as a live-fire bombing range by the U.S. military from the Second World War until 1990, before being returned to the state of Hawaii in 1994. Still full of unexploded ordnance, still being cleared sacred ground that was shelled for half a century. 100. And for our last fact, I want to tell you about a group of islands that were not sunk or burned or bombed. They are still there. The palms are still there. The lagoons are still there. And they are as lost as anything we have talked about tonight, because the people were removed. The Chagos archipelago sits in the middle of the Indian Ocean, around 60 islands in 7 atolls, the largest of which is Diego Garcia. People had lived there for generations, descendants of enslaved and indentured laborers brought from Africa, Madagascar, and India to work the coconut plantations, who, over 2 centuries, became a distinct people with their own Creole and their own way of life. They called themselves Chagosians, or Iloas, the Islanders. In 1965, as Mauritius moved towards independence, Britain detached the archipelago and created a new territory called the British Indian Ocean Territory, and then agreed to make Diego Garcia available to the United States for a military base. The condition was that the islands be handed over empty. Between roughly 1968 and 1973, the entire population, around 1.5 to 2,000 people, was removed. Islanders who traveled to Mauritius for medical treatment were told they could not go home. Supplies were cut off. And on Diego Garcia itself, in an act that survivors describe more often than almost anything else, the islanders' dogs were rounded up and killed in a sealed shed in front of them before they were put on ships. They were deposited in Mauritius and the Seychelles, mostly into poverty, with no housing and no work, and no compensation worth the name. They have been fighting in courts ever since. British courts, European courts, the International Court of Justice, which in 2019 delivered an advisory opinion that the detachment of the archipelago had been unlawful and that Britain should end its administration. In October 2024, Britain announced an agreement to transfer sovereignty to Mauritius while leasing back the base. A treaty was signed in May 2025, and at the time I'm recording this, the ratification has become badly entangled in politics and is still unresolved. Meanwhile, a base with a runway and a harbor operates on Diego Garcia, and the great-grandchildren of the people who were born there have, for the most part, never seen it. And this is not the only island emptied for what was underneath it. On Banaba, Ocean Island in the Central Pacific, phosphate rock was mined for most of the 20th century, until roughly 9/10 of the island's surface had been dug away, leaving a landscape of bare coral pinnacles. The Banabans were relocated in 1945 to Rabi Island in Fiji, thousands of kilometers away, where their descendants still live and still hold their identity as Banabans. And on Nauru, the same phosphate, the accumulated droppings of seabirds over unthinkable stretches of time, made the country briefly one of the richest per person on Earth, before the deposits ran out and left an interior that has been stripped to rock, islands that were consumed, not lost to the sea, loaded onto ships, a shipload at a time, and spread on fields on the other side of the world. Pause. So that's 100 islands, more or less, that aren't where they were. And now that the counting is finished, and there's nothing left to keep track of, I want to stay out here on the water with you for a little while longer, with the numbers put away, and mention a few last things very slowly, in no particular order, in the way you talk at the end of a long evening when nobody is really trying to make a point anymore. Because there are islands that hold on, and they're worth thinking about too. There is Skellig Michael, 11 kilometers off the coast of County Kerry, a jagged pyramid of rock rising 200 meters out of the Atlantic, where, sometime in the early Middle Ages, monks decided to live. They cut roughly 600 steps into the rock by hand. They built beehive huts of dry stone, without mortar, corbelled so precisely that they have kept the rain out for well over 1,000 years. Vikings raided them at least twice. They stayed for centuries, and then, probably in the 12th or 13th century, as the climate cooled and the seas grew rougher and the monastic world changed around them, they moved to the mainland. The huts are still there. The steps are still there. Puffins nest in the walls. It is one of the very few places on Earth where you can stand inside a building, put up by people who thought the edge of the world was the correct place to be. There is Rockhall, which is barely an island at all, a granite tooth in the North Atlantic, about 25 meters across, with no soil, no fresh water, and no shelter, over 400 kilometers from the nearest inhabited land. Britain formally annexed it in 1955 by landing a party from a helicopter to cement a plaque to the rock, an act of sovereignty conducted in a heavy swell with a bag of cement. Its ownership and the seabed rights around it are still argued over by 4 countries, and a small number of people have gone out and lived on it deliberately, alone, to prove a point or raise money for charity. A former soldier named Tom McLean occupied it for 40 days in 1985, sleeping in a plywood box bolted to the summit, and others have since stayed longer. Somewhere out there tonight, waves are breaking over a rock the size of a living room that 3 or 4 governments would quite like to own. There is Pheasant Island, in the middle of the river that separates France and Spain, a strip of land about 200 meters long, with nobody living on it. Since the Treaty of the Pyrenees was signed there in 1659, it has been a condominium. Sovereignty alternates between the 2 nations every 6 months, handed over in a small ceremony, so that for half the year it is Spanish, and for half the year it is French. It has been doing this quietly for over 360 years, and it is slowly eroding, and both countries have had to shore it up, which means France and Spain are cooperating to prevent the disappearance of an island that is only symbolically theirs, in alternate halves. There is North Sentinel Island in the Andamans, where the Sentinelese have lived for what may be tens of thousands of years, and have made it consistently and unambiguously clear that they do not want visitors. India enforces an exclusion zone around it, which is, when you think about it, one of the few genuinely enlightened policies any modern state has adopted towards an isolated people. Leave them alone, because they asked, and because a common cold could kill them all. When the great tsunami of 2004 struck, there was real fear for them. A helicopter went out days later to check, and was met by a man on the beach firing arrows at it, which everyone involved took, correctly, as excellent news. There is Henderson Island in the middle of the South Pacific, part of the Pitcairn Group. Nobody lives there. The nearest major population center is thousands of kilometers away. It is about as remote as land gets on this planet. And in 2017, a research team published a survey of its beaches and estimated that they held something like 37 million pieces of plastic debris, weighing around 17 tons, one of the highest densities of plastic waste ever recorded anywhere on Earth, delivered entirely by ocean currents from places its beaches have never had any contact with. Bottle caps, fishing floats, toothbrushes, hermit crabs living in cosmetic jars. There's no longer any such thing as an island that the rest of the world does not reach, and there are islands still being found and unfound. In 2021, a group of researchers landed on a small gravel bank off the north coast of Greenland and announced they had found the northernmost land on Earth and gave it a name, Qeqertaq Avanarlek, the northernmost island. It was in the news everywhere. And then Danish authorities looked more carefully at the survey data and concluded that it probably wasn't an island at all, but a shifting bank of gravel and ice, of the sort that appears and disappears in that region all the time. So there it is. 400 years after Friesland and Bus Island, we are still doing this. We are still discovering land that turns out not to be land, and having to take it off the map again. And there is one more thing happening right now that I find quietly remarkable, and it's the closest thing tonight to a hopeful ending. The nations of the Pacific have collectively declared that their maritime boundaries, the enormous ocean territories that their tiny islands entitle them to, should be fixed permanently as they currently stand, regardless of what the sea does to the coastlines that generated them. In other words, even if the land moves, even if an island becomes a sandbank, even if a country's physical territory changes shape entirely, the country continues. Its waters remain its waters. Its statehood does not dissolve because its beach did. That principle has been gaining support in international law, and it represents something genuinely new. The idea that a nation might be a thing that persists independently of the ground it was standing on. The Maldives are raising artificial land at Hulhumalé, an island built 2 meters higher than the natural islands around it, now home to tens of thousands of people, precisely because the natural islands are only a meter or so above the sea. Whole countries are, in slow motion, learning to be portable. So let's begin to let all of this go now. Softly, think about what we've actually been doing tonight. We started with an island that never existed, drawn from a sighting of floating stone by a tired whaler in 1876. And we ended with a nation making digital copies of itself so that it can outlive its own coastline. And in between, there were monks and mutineers and lighthouse keepers, a woman surviving 2 years on a rock full of screaming birds, a drunk gatekeeper in a Welsh legend, 3,000 people leaving a coal mine in the space of 3 months, a girl born on Roanoke Island whose fate nobody has ever known, and a whole people put onto ships so that a runway could be built where their houses were. And the thing all of them have in common, the phantom islands and the drowned ones, and the bombed ones and the abandoned ones, is that they were, every single one, somebody's certainty. Somebody looked at that place and thought, that's land, that's solid. That will be there tomorrow, and it will be there for my children. The cartographer inking High Brazil onto a chart was not being fanciful. He was recording what everyone knew. The families on Holland Island planting a garden in 1910 were not living somewhere temporary. They were home. The people of Bikini were told it would be for a little while. It turns out that land is one of the slowest things we know, which is precisely why we mistake it for one of the permanent ones. Coastlines move. Deltas breathe. Volcanoes build islands in a night and take them back in a season. Ice retreats and the sea comes up behind it, and quietly floods a country under the North Sea while people are still living on it, generation by generation, each one noticing only that the fishing has moved a little further inland. Nobody in Doggerland woke up one morning and said, "Our country is ending." They just moved the camp a bit higher up the valley, and then their grandchildren did, and then theirs. There's something in that I find genuinely restful, and I hope you do too. Not comforting in a cheap way. The losses tonight were real, and some of them were cruel, and some of them were nobody's fault at all. But there's a kind of peace available in remembering that permanence was never the arrangement. The map has always been a draft. Every chart ever printed has been out of date in some small way by the time the ink dried. And sailors have always known this, and have always gone out anyway, and have always drawn the coastline as best they could, knowing perfectly well that somebody after them would have to correct it. So you don't need to hold on to any of this. Not the names, not the dates, not the 100 islands. Let Sandy Island go back to being deep water. Let the bells of Rungholt go quiet under the mud. Let the Moai stand in their quarry, half-finished in the dark. Let Surtsey keep eroding, a few centimeters a year, exactly as it should. And if it helps you drift, picture this last thing. Somewhere in the North Atlantic tonight, on an empty island where nobody has lived for nearly a century, there's a single street of stone houses with grass growing over the thresholds. The wind is coming off the water the way it always does. There are a million seabirds asleep on the cliffs above, and the houses are just sitting there in the dark, patient, not waiting for anyone, doing what they have done every night for 90-odd years, which is nothing at all. Let your breathing slow down to that. Let the whole map go soft at the edges. There is nothing you need to find tonight, and nothing you need to keep. Sleep well,